When I was 18 years old, I wanted to be a storyteller. And I looked around, and the other 18 and 17-year-olds thought I was crazy. And my mother would sit me down on a dilapidated old couch with my 5 brothers and sisters and say, "You're not getting up until you hear this story." And I learned about the family history. I learned about West Virginia and Ohio, the only 2 places that we were ever going until I was in my late 20s. I learned what I needed to learn through story. I fell in love with narrative. And when I confided this to my friends, there was not too many youth tellers out there. Generally, if you go to a storytelling festival, it's starting to change. But 10, 15 years ago, youth definitely were not on the stages, the major stages of storytelling. And I felt alone until I found a storytelling guild in Cleveland, Ohio, who said, "We would love to listen to your stories." And I thought, as a high school teacher, what way am I going to connect to my students? So I decided to get a master's degree in storytelling and education. But my real master's degree is to listening from my parents, who told me story after story about their lives, and even made up a few on the way. And I was not connecting with the Canterbury Tales with my students until I started using story. When I started using story, they began to listen more. They would come into the door on that first day and say, "Oh, I'm really worried about, oh, you're the storytelling teacher. I think the class will be okay now. I've heard about you." And we began to teach the Canterbury Tales through the Brunswick Tales, which was the name of the school. We began to write pastoral love poetry as though they were going to drive-in theaters. We began to look at the narrative. I fell in love with story, and I began to study it with my master's degree and perform as a professional teller. And initially, I was one of those holistic tellers. Don't tell it with anyone else. You have to tell it this way. You have to tell it this way. And then my life changed. Jennifer Woolley walked up to me and said, "Mr. Cordi, you tell stories every time you teach, whether you're teaching history, humanities, reading. Why?" I said, "Well, you know, Jen, I apologized that for a long time ago." She says, "You don't understand. I want to be involved in telling stories too. Could we have a storytelling club?" And I said, "Sure, a youth storytelling club? That'd be great, but I don't know the first thing about it." I knew of one in Eugene, Oregon, and very successful, but I'd never contacted that person. And Jen said, "Mr. Cordi, you don't have to worry about it. I'll take care of it." We were scheduled to tell ghost stories in a dark, dank basement for 1/2 hour. Have you ever tried to tell ghost stories in a half hour? It is impossible. 3.5 hours later, we were still telling ghost stories. 4 people in the basement. And the next hour was telling stories about family members' stories, and then children's books. And 4.5 hours later, Jennifer stood up and said, "Next week's assignment will be." And I knew that story was perhaps one of the greatest teaching tools that we have. So we started Voices of Illusion, and I became the first full-time high school storytelling teacher in the country for 11 years. My full curriculum was story. Teachers would come up to me and say, "Kevin, I know the people in your classes because they're good and effective writers. They're not afraid to speak up in class or add to discussion, and they score well on their tests." Storytelling is a community art that you can teach anything through a story. I was the national coordinator for storytelling, and we started Voices Across America Youth Storytelling Project, where we've registered over 80 youth storytelling groups all over the country and in Scotland. I have watched hundreds and thousands of students find their voice through story. I have learned to listen more so I can hear more. These students need a voice. In their classes, in their homes, and their community, they are rarely asked, "What is your story?" I was 18 years old. I was by myself wanting to be a storyteller. Some students don't want to be storytellers. They just want to tell their story. They need a place to find their voice. I've traveled with an award-winning youth storytelling group for 11 years. They've taught me so much. Now I'm the National Chair for Youth Storytelling, co-chair for the National Storytelling Network. Storytelling and working with kids is my life. It's what I do. It's not only my occupation, it's my vocation. It's the greatest teaching tool that we have. It's what will connect from adult to child, from child to child. Regardless of ability or level, everyone can tell a story.